Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales and I am on Gadigal land. I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here joining us for our November Scholar Talk. My name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship here at the library, and today I'm able to introduce our 2022 David Scott Mitchell Fellow, Shuxia Chen. Now, some of you will already know Shuxia from her work as a curator at the Chau Chak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney, and be familiar with what she has done around Sino-Australian relationships and women and pictorial collections here at the library. If you have any questions about her research that she's done while she's been with us as a fellow, please pop those questions into the chat feature of Zoom and we'll come to those after her presentation this morning. But I've had a sneak peek of her slides and we are in for a fabulous treat. So I'm not going to waste any time and hand over straight to Shuxia. Thank you for coming.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. Before I start, I also would like to acknowledge that I am zooming from the unceded lands of Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respect to elders past and present. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank the State Library of New South Wales for the David Scott Mitchell Memorial Fellowship, which supports this research project. I thank Rachel, the scholarship coordinator, and all the librarians for their help during my fellowship here. I also would like to extend my gratitude to the library's senior curator, Jeffrey Baker, for his help with identifying materials and navigating the different online interface of the library website and online database. I also would like to thank expert colleagues Guomei Fen, Sophie Loy-Wilson, and Peter Heck for their conversations and suggestions on researching Chinese Australian history. This generous support for the library and peers has greatly encouraged me, a historian and curator on Chinese art and photography history, to embark on a research project beyond my academic comfort zone, yet highly related to my personal experience as a female Chinese Australian with a family history that spans Chinese diasporic communities between San Francisco, California, Canada, and Australia. Over the past century or more, I have been crossing borders from a very young age to visit my grandmother, grandparents, parents, and siblings, and even now. So, I'll probably share my slides, and then we will start. Okay, so the Chinese Australian women in this study, their agency and efforts navigating the complexities between the two unfamiliar yet aligned nations, China and Australia, during World War II, have empowered me to face the challenges a woman of color still needs to confront in the 21st century Australia. I hope this project could in time make a humble contribution to the limited visibility of Chinese Australian women in Australian history. As we know, the existing literature on Chinese Australian history has tended to focus on male elites. Of course, this partly reflects the fact the earliest migrants from China were male due to labor demands of the gold rush era and government policies strictly limiting female migrants. The early archives therefore reflect a richness of male-centered records, while the increasing awareness of the role of Chinese Australian women in this history. However, there has been a growing interest in elucidating their roles in Australian history. One recent groundbreaking publication is Kay Bankno and Julia T. Martinez's edited volume, Locating Chinese Women, Historical Mobility Between China and Australia, which provides multiple multiple perspectives on how Chinese Australian women express themselves by engaging public life while navigating the upheavals of the 20th century. And another recent edited volume by John Fitzgerald and Hong Ming Yip, Chinese Diaspora Charity and the Cantonese Pacific, 1850 to 1949, also includes rich case studies by scholar Guo Meifen and Dennis Alston, highlighting what they term the invisible work by women, bridging the informal networks between Australia and China, and innovating philanthropy sociability among Chinese diasporic civic societies. And another recent publications, Sophie Lloyd Wilson, Australians in Shanghai, Race, Right, a Nation in Treaty Port, China, also shares important perspectives on women's histories within a particular pioneer family of Chinese Australian elites. The Bengal and Martinez book, Locating Chinese Women, has given detailed literature review on writings on this topic over the past 2 decades in the field, so I won't summarize further here. Despite these pioneer efforts, research on the diverse roles of ethnically Chinese women in Australia, Chinese history remains relatively limited. My project aims to contribute to this body of work through the rich collection of the State Library of New South Wales and other scattered materials in research that grapples with the complexity of issues such as gender, identity, and nationality for the Chinese diaspora. So by piecing these initiatives and networks woven by such Chinese Australian women, especially by the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund, active between 1937 and the early 1940s, similarly from the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War, with the Marco Polo Bridge incident and the Battle of Shanghai in 1937, and the early years of the World War II. So I will provide the context of the small population of Chinese Australian women and the formation of the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund, its connection to China, and the broader international network after the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937. And then I will analyze through their activities and mobilization of local audience to try to argue and propose their active and social citizenship within such context. The invisibility of Chinese Australian women in the first half of 20th century is partly a result of the fall of overall Chinese population in Australia, which fell to less than half its period size between the two world wars, leaving with the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, the core of the White Australia policy, which aimed specifically to weaken the Chinese community. According to the 1933 census, there were around 4,000 people of Chinese nationality residing in New South Wales, with only 77 women. The numbers of Australian-born women of Chinese heritage were also very low. The census figures show there were 727 males and 640 females. By 1947, the overall population with Chinese heritage was just over 12,000, with 2/3 of the community born in Australia or arriving before 1901. And there were only about 2,500 Chinese women and girls in Australia. Being wives and daughters of a very small ethnic community in white Australia, Chinese Australian women were often silenced. However, with communal support and involvement in women's associations, this small group of women had made tremendous effort fundraising for refugees in war-torn China. The emergence of such women's organizations coincided with the rising number of the culturally specific civil society groups in Australia's major cities during the World War II. The formation of Chinese women societies and engagement of public affairs for the war demonstrated their agency as active citizens. Such agency could also be demonstrated by their effort of capitalizing their husbands' networks within Australia and between China and Australia. So for these reasons, the activities and networks of the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund is a compelling case study on the agency of Chinese Australian women and the forming of social citizenship in Australia before the end of World War II. And the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund was part of the international network of the Chinese Women's National War Relief Association, 中国妇女慰劳自卫抗战将士总会, which was established by Song Meilin or Madame Chiang Kai-shek in Nanjing on 1st August 1937, just after the Japanese bombardment of Shanghai, consolidating many women's societies active at the time. Its aim was to support the needs of the anti-Japanese war, to mobilize women compatriots at home and abroad to devote their financial resources and energies to the work of saving the country. The leaders of this association were mainly the wives of regional and local cadres of the Kuomintang, the ruling nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek. As we can see here, that's Song Meilin spoke at the establishment of the Chinese Women's National War Relief Association, and here immediately after that there's a group photo of the executive committee of this association. However, this association also accepted Chinese Communist Party's members under the Second United Front, the agreement between the Kuomintang and Chinese Communist Party to suspend the Chinese Civil War in order to collectively resist the Japanese military advance. The New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund was formed in September 1937, a few weeks after the establishment of the Chinese Women's National War Relief Association, in response to the Sino-Japanese War, which happens between 1937 to 1945. And I quoted here that from a letter addressed to Madame T.W. Shung, which is Shuxia Chen, president of the Hong Kong branch of the National Women's Relief Association, and wife of Song Ziwen, U.S. educated brother of the Song sisters and the later Minister of Foreign Affairs and Premier of the Republic of China. And the letter was dated 1st October 1937 and written in English, as we can see it in the screen. I quote here, the New South Wales Chinese Women's Relief Fund was formed a few weeks ago and is representative of all the Chinese women of the state of New South Wales, who decided to form this organization to enable them to carry out patriotic work in the best possible way. Our activities are directed towards the raising of funds to be devoted to the Chinese Red Cross and the relief of the refugees. Included in the later form of the relief are clothing, blankets, and food supplies. Like our compatriots in their home country, the various Chinese communities of Australia are united in a single purpose. Factions, politics, and differences are cast aside. There is but one object and one goal: to strive together in complete united for the welfare and good of China, to help by every manner and means possible, and to spare no effort and pursue every endeavor until the Japanese invader is beaten off and our country is free. End quote. Here one can read this New South Wales organization's response to the aim of the Chinese Women's National War Relief Association. Moreover, such a response also resonated with an article attributed to Song Meilin, Republican China's First Lady, published in Sydney's Daily Telegraph newspaper the following week on 6 October 1937, titled War and Chinese Women. The article exposed the brutal acts of the Japanese Imperial Army in its invasion of China and praised Chinese women for their righteous deeds in fighting in the anti-Japanese war. Some suggests that from comforting wounded soldiers and supporting refugees to advocating thrift campaigns, Chinese women have contributed their abilities and financial resources to the entire wartime work. And we could see there is other correspondence between the president of the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund, Mrs. C.J. Chen, and the president of the Hong Kong branch, WWII Chen, the patriotic work to China and sorrows of the suffering of Chinese subject to the terrible invasion of Japanese indicated patriotic sentiment towards the home country, China. Like the structure of other Chinese women's war relief associations, the committee members of the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund were wives and daughters of Chinese elite in Australia, particularly in Sydney, in this case. From the speech manuscript of the first public fundraising event organized by the Relief Fund, we can see who organizing committee members were. The patroness was Mr. C.J. Pao, an American and wife of then Chinese Consul General Dr. Bao Junjian. We could see some photograph in the State Library archive that the couple possibly in their residence in Sydney, and then also there is a Chinese Australian woman courtesy to Mrs. Pao, wife of Chinese Consul General during the famous Chinese Dragon Ball at the Tocadero on 1st July 1940. So the president was Mrs. J.A. Chia, wife of James A. Chia, leader of the Yihing Secret Society or Chinese Masonic Society, and the Young China League, who had been highly involved with the Republican movement of the mainland China since 1910s. The society had been active and raised funds for the cause in China. It seems reasonable to assume that Mr. Chia's networks in China and in Australia and expertise in community fundraising was shared with Mrs. Chia. From the list of the Relief Fund leaders, one sees the strong connection between this newly formed Women Australian organization, the Husbands Networks, and the Nationalist Republic of China. From the same speech transcript, Chinese Consul General Dr. Pao also had his opening remark on the occasion of this first public event, the Grand Fete. It was also the Chinese Consul General Dr. Pao who notified the New South Wales Chinese Relief Fund of the Hong Kong branch's appeal for medical supplies needed by the Chinese Red Cross. One might assume the establishment of the Relief Fund was very possibly advocated by the Consul with the support of J.A. Chia. Their close connections with the nationalist government and their actions of advocating and fundraising for war-torn China demonstrate a sort of diasporic patriotism. Being ethnic women in white Australia, limited by law from being full citizens, Chinese Australian women may have felt empowered by being needed and perhaps even had a sense of belonging to China, the home country, during the time of national crisis. However, I would ask if there is only diaspora nationalist sentiment through the work of the members of New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund. Could such empowerment agency could be interpreted as active citizenship in Australia, despite the white Australian policy? For the rest of the talk, I will propose English sinologist T.H. Marshall's classic concept of social citizenship as a framework, trying to understand the complex identity and gendered politics of Chinese Australian women in the 30s and 40s Australia. So the first public event, as I mentioned, the Grand Fete in Sydney Town Hall on 19 November 1937, demonstrates their skill in utilizing mainstream media to promote their cause. The article titled Chinese Women Work for China, published in the Daily Telegraph the day before the fete, provided significant publicity for the fete and its alignment with China's war effort for mainstream Australian society. At the fete, the opening speech by Mrs. J.A. Chia stressed the significance of working in such a worthy cause, but more and also is saying that tomorrow at our Eastern Fair in the Sydney Town Hall, the Chinese population of Sydney are making their first public appeal. And then this is the next day, an article published by the Labour Daily newspaper, an image of Miss Jane Lunbeif in Chinese traditional cheongsam holding a Chinese girl playing with a doll at the fete in support of the Red Cross appeal demonstrated the Chinese Australian community's support for Australia's role in war effort. Such effort also manifested by an image here of President and Executive Committee members of the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund, presenting a check to the Superintendent of New South Wales Division of Australia Red Cross, published in Sydney Morning Herald on 5th March of 1938. Apart from the own, and here is some of the receipt of the medical supply purchase from the Elliott and Australian Drug Company, from some of the fund that raised by the New South Wales Chinese Women's Relief. And in addition to raising funds through public fete and music concerts, they also engage with famous Chinese, Australian, and international women speakers and celebrities, or including figures such as Alice Lee Kim, Mrs. Fabian Chow, which is addressed in this receipt, and Mrs. Alice Lee Song, with a cocktail party on 30th April 1938. And Alice Lee Kim, being considered as the goodwill ambassador between China and Australia, for those who are interested in her life story and her role in Sino-Australian relations, please refer to the recent publication of Paul McGregor's article in Locating Chinese Women, the artistic volume I mentioned at the beginning. So we come back to this receipt. From the receipt showing only a few bottles of alcohol and small amount of pastry and oysters, one could tell it was quite a small and probably really small cozy party. This cocktail party was one of the social events Mrs. Fabian Cho, which is Alice Lim Ki, attended amid her 3-month visit across Australia in 1938. She arrived in Australia together with Chinese American woman Elsie Lee Song as the Chinese delegates to the International Women's Conference held in Sydney on 1st to 4th February 1938 as part of the Australian centennial celebrations. The inclusion of the conference in the sesquicentennial celebrations indicates the strength of the women's movement in Australia between the wars and the importance of international networks between women that supported the conference. On 4th February, the last day of the International Women's Conference, Alice Lim Ki and Elsie Lee Song read out a goodwill message by Song Meiling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, titled "This Changing World, Women's Part in It." In her message, Song urged the women of the world to turn their attention to the difficult circumstances experienced in China in the midst of the Sino-Japanese War. Song's message was included at the end of the pamphlet here, titled Century of Sino-Australian Relations, privately produced by then Chinese Consul General Dr. Bao Junjian during the sesquicentennial, I quote here, to enhance a closer Sino-Australian relationship by emphasizing China's devotion to peace and international cooperation. It also advocates for Chinese Australians who were discriminated against a broader society convinced of its own racial superiority, while highlighting the history and influence of Chinese migration to Australia. Alice Lim Ki and Elsie Lee Song, as representatives of Chinese delegates, were also on their mission to promote the urgent need for help for the war refugees in China through cultural activities. Here that we can see there is an image portraits of them in the age and under the section of the World of Women. And amid their cultural activities, Elsie Song and as Lin Kim organized demonstrations of Chinese cooking, and also a kind of Chinese beauty pageant featuring attractive young Chinese women in dress of different dynasties. These were the two main events. From the title here, we could see from this Australian Women's Weekly report, eating in Chinese style. Chinese food was referred as a novelty comparing to French and Australian food. The recipes included in this article provided by Mrs. Li Song, and the recipe included steamed rice, fried fish with sweet and sour sauce, mushroom soup, fuyong omelette, chops, I think it's char siu, steak and vegetables, chicken, pineapple, and Cantonese rice. The image accompanying this article, which we can see from the screen here, showed Li Song in traditional garment for performance, dancing in front of the KMT flag. The article reflects the prevailing tendency of exoticizing China and Chinese women in particular. However, to some extent, we can also see the performance of cultural difference catering for an Orientalist fascination with Chinese culture, which would construct a non-threatening and approachable image of China. Such an approach also was shared by Chinese American women in campaigns for China in the US during World War II. As such, overseas Chinese women's participation in fundraising campaigns during World War II was significant. According to some statistics from the Republic of China, the money raised by overseas Chinese women in 1939 amounted to 1/5 of, which is 10 to 20% of the Chinese government's war expenditure for that year. The enthusiasm on Chinese women's involvement in public life by working together towards a common goal demonstrated that while they celebrate the Chinese cultural identity through cultural activities, they also asserted their support for Australia's role in the international affair as members of local community-based campaigns. As I mentioned that at the beginning, English sinologist T.H. Marshall's classic concept of social citizenship as a status bestowed on those who are full members of a community is worth revisiting as a framework through which to analyze the work of the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund. Rather than defining citizenship in terms of the nation state and discrete legal rights and obligations, Marshall refers to citizenship as a membership of a community. I quote here, a multi-tier construct which applies to people's membership in a variety of collectivities, local, ethnic, national, and transnational, end quote. This concept considers citizenship not only as a status, but also as a means of active involvement and participation in the determination, practice, and promotion of a common good. The formation of the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund, in a way, was to respond to the international networks of Chinese Women's National War Relief Association established in China, and to appeal through notification of then Chinese Consul General Dr. Pao. However, as a formal organization in Australia, their establishment and active involvement in politically mobilizing the Chinese Australian community and beyond to support war-torn China could be considered an expression of social citizenship. And an opening speech, which I also referred earlier in this talk, that at the Grand Fete organized by the Women Relief at Sydney Town Hall, the President, Mrs. J.A. Chen, stressed, I quote here, "I believe that this is the first occasion in the history of the Chinese community of New South Wales that the Chinese ladies have emerged from the privacy of their homes to band together to work in such a worthy cause," end quote. And it was reported by, as I say, the mainstream newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, the day before. And also here that the day before the fete, I also report here that Mrs. J.A. Chen said, I quote, "One thing that I will make us feel not quite so hopeless, the sending of relief in medical goods and clothing. It is for the good, it is for the cause of humanity," end quote. Here, Chau emphasizes not the patriotic goal of the relief aid, but rather a more altruistic sense of shared humanity beyond the notion of diasporic identification with China. Chair stresses that the sympathy and kindness of all classes in New South Wales towards this cause for Chinese refugees when they ask for all closed door to door. From the notes on the names and addresses, which is here, that donors may have mostly been women and some Chinese small business and community organizations from across regional New South Wales and Greater Sydney, the eastern suburbs, the inner city, and parts of the inner west and south as well. These Chinese ladies did mobilize a wide range of individuals, Chinese and non-Chinese, who may be assumed from their addresses to represent different classes too. Here is the receipt of their donation. And here from the program of the concert in the Tivoli Theatre on 24th November 1937, we could also see performers were from a very diverse backgrounds, singing and playing Chinese and non-Chinese music. The sympathy to war-torn China and the fear to the common enemy of China and Australia, Japan, helped the work of the Relief Fund, supporting Chinese-Australian war effort against Japanese invasion in China, was thus portrayed as supporting Australia's war effort. As Melanie Oppenheimer has argued, contributing to patriotic funds and supporting the war effort was linked to active citizenship and a sense of duty, not only to one's family and local community, but to Australia. The multiple collectivities related to ethnic, gender, national, and transnational of the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund and the active participation in an international affair for China within Australia demonstrated the social citizenship amid World War II. And also that was a crucial time of Sino-Australian relations when Australian government began its first diplomatic appointment to China. This women's active and informal diplomatic connections between China and Australia manifest the complex senses of gendered politics, national belonging, and transnational concern. The New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund might stop operation when the Chinese Women's National War Relief Association in China had stopped its operation in 1949 after the end of World War II. This is here, you can say this is the latest receipt from the State Library Chinese Women's Relief Fund records. And it is a receipt to a florist for a wreath dated on 24th September 1941. I could not locate any formal announcement on the closure of the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund. However, the work on Chinese relief continued in Australia, which could be evidenced by a small news article published by Launceston in Tasmania's local newspaper Examiners on 30th January 1946, stating that the donations from button sales and store sales had increased the Chinese Relief Fund. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What amazing work those women were doing. So thank you for sharing all of that, and so much detail in the collection to see those little strips of receipts that let you see where some of those donations are coming in. We do have a few questions for you already. If you're listening at home or at work, please feel free to ask a question. So someone's asking about how they were perceived in their own time, and you have a little bit of information there. You mentioned that they were sidelined as a community, as a group, but they were incredibly ambitious women. And while it was acknowledged that their efforts should be appreciated, was there any acknowledgement in their own time of how ambitious they were and how hard it was for them as Chinese women in a society that didn't necessarily appreciate them or their contributions? Did they have that in their own time, or has that recognition for how difficult their work was come much later?
I think the recognition was really limited at that time within Australia, as I could locate it. Some of the newspaper articles mainly actively promoting their effort and their activities. So I think it was their effort to do the publicity instead of the reception from the general Australian community. But as you could see for from the letters that to Mrs. T.V. Song, the president of the Hong Kong branch of the Chinese Women Relief Fund, that within 2 months, they had really mobilized and collected donation of a variety of people in Australia, in New South Wales. So there were sympathy to the war effort, but I would say that the recognition was really limited at the time.
How did they model their organisation? I have a really interesting question that's come through about the structure of the organisation and the types of activities that they pursued to raise funds. Do you know if they based that on other things that other Australian groups were doing, or was that modelled on what perhaps their mothers knew from China and raising money at home?
I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, that the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund, the president, Mrs. James A. Chair, definitely had access to a greater network through the work of her husband, James A. Chair, community leader and highly connected to the Republican government, and they would have similar sort of fundraising model starting from like 1910s, and also similar this type of structure. Also, I mentioned that the New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund was one of the branch of the global network initiated by Song Qingling in Nanjing on 1st of August 1937 as a national Chinese Women's Relief Association. So they would replicate the model from the fundraising event back in China. But as I sort of presented the events such as, you know, fete, but like also concerts and sales, performance, and this is quite you know, typical fundraising events share not just in Australia, not just in China, but across the world. And I remember, I remember when I'm researching for this research, I of course looked at the fundraising events in US, because that was huge as well. And in fact, they actually donated most of the money for the relief fund internationally. So even back in the 20s, after sort of World War I, that the Chinese community in US, they already using similar events to raise funds for the cause in China. And there's another event, I talk about the so the Miss China or Beauty Queen of Chinatown, this type of events also being used during this type of campaigns, and it was also being studied and by diasporic historians in US and in Australia as well.
Because I was particularly struck by the bravery of those women in putting themselves out there and sharing quite intimate things about their culture, you know, the way they cook and the way they dress, and, you know, such a rich heritage, and then sort of having it manipulated and westernized so that it's easier for a local Australian audience to understand or connect with. That takes a lot of work, I think, to be able to put yourself out there like that, even if it is for a good cause. And somebody's commenting in the chat now, reading some of the articles that you shared with us. One of the fundraisers, £800 that they had raised so far. So, I mean, that's a lot of money. That, you know, when I was looking at the whiskey list, how much the whiskey cost, £800 is certainly, you know, it's a huge effort. Somebody's asking about the newspapers that you've shared with us today, and asking, perhaps this is a bit outside of what you've looked at because it might not have been in the collection, but do you know, so radio was obviously around in Australia at that time. Do you know if they did any radio reviews or interviews to promote their work?
Yeah, I definitely will presume that would be. I haven't found any clip myself, but as I mentioned, one case study of Alice Limke. She was a broadcaster and really actively working in Shanghai through radio, and we know that the some of the Song Mei-ling's messages, early messages in 1937 was also broadcast in Australia radio as well, together, if from my memory was correct, together with the article being published in the mainstream media. So radio definitely was another means for mobilizing for the cause and more effort in China. But of course, due to the limitation of access to archive, and this type of archive is also really hard to keep. But I presume that would be really active.
Someone's suggesting we can look to the ABC archives. They think that they will have some fabulous content for you there. And you've already mentioned the work of Chinese American women and their fundraising efforts. And somebody's commenting on that in the chat now. And they're wondering if any particular figures in that movement were inspirational for the Australian efforts, and for the Australian organisation, how it really came about. Was it a group of women perhaps that sat around and said, let's do something? Was there a single figure that really sparked it and started recruiting people early on? What do you know about the very beginnings?
Actually, from just go back to the American questions, as I haven't sort of delved into the materials as much as here, that definitely, as I mentioned, they actually, the scale was much larger than Australia, and the relief funds not just within the Chinese Australian community. It was with particularly the Christian related group, the religious group that they had been very active in fundraising for World War II war effort, particularly for China. And the Look Foundation and the company, they were the biggest one that's doing fundraising events, as well as publications. They would send photographers to China to take photographs of war-torn Shanghai, and using images through publications to mobilize and the greater general American audience. One of the image by journalist Huang Xiaoting, I'm sure that people who are familiar with the World War II images, there was a baby was crying on a railway in Shanghai. That image that's really being reproduced across different newspapers as well. So the means in America, the means of fundraising for the war effort in China, I think the scale comparing to Australia was much bigger, and it is really beyond the Chinese Australian community. And back in the Australia, that you know, how did these women started the organization? And I share there was a newspaper by the Daily Telegraph reported the day before the Eastern Fair in the Sydney Town Hall with the image of the president of the Chinese Women Relief, Mrs. J.A. Chair, that in there that she basically mentioned that they met every Mondays and get the women together, presumably in someone's home, maybe her home, they definitely really domestic space, and they would gather these clothes that they got from donor by knocking on the door, but they would sit on Monday together to amend these clothes or to make it better, or you know, all these sort of really typical gendered activities that we could imagine for these women to do to fix the old clothes or to wash them, to make them more presentable and usable for the refugees in China. And also on Mondays that they would discuss what kind of events that they would you know, organize. So there were many Mondays, Monday evenings gatherings by these women. And I also share I did mention at the beginning of the talk that I share a letter by Mrs. Chair addressed to Madam T.W. Song, the president of the Hong Kong branch in Chinese Relief Fund, that they actually was notified by the Australian consul, by the Chinese Consul General, Dr. Pao, of the Red Cross appeal for medical, you know, support. Hence, they sort of quickly organize and knock at people's door and get clothes, because clothing and blankets and also medical supplies were crucial for those.
Critical.
Yeah. So I think that's and of course that going back to the model, that they have the model from China, they also have the model through the husband's community organization. So you know, male-centered civil societies of Chinese Australian community by Chinese Australian were not uncommon at the time, particularly during World War II. There was a like really increase of this type of civil societies within you know, Chinese community, and also other sort of ethnic communities as well. So for women community, a women association, that was rare, given that, you know, by 1947, that's already past war, that there are only 2,500 Chinese Australian women in Australia. So that was really small amount of women. And from the article that at the beginning that this New South Wales Chinese Women Relief Fund, they had about 80 members, but 80 within New South Wales. That was huge.
Huge. Yeah.
given that the small amount of women across the whole Australia, and yeah, so I think they had mobilized many women with Chinese heritage within these campaigns.
It's such fascinating work and an excellent example of networking when you think that, you know, it's before any sort of electronic communication, which would make it so easy to recruit from such a small cohort of women. But someone is asking if there were similar efforts in other states of Australia, and I'm thinking perhaps in Victoria, there might have been something going on. Do you know anything about what other people were doing?
Yes, definitely. I was well, before I shared the screen, I actually had a catalog of an exhibition organized by the Victoria Chinese Women Relief Fund of an exhibition in 1941. So as I mentioned, that really this relief fund is one of the branch of many branches across the world. So in Australia, in Sydney, and of course in Victoria as well. So they held basically Chinese antiquity exhibitions in Melbourne to raise funds, and all of the objects actually through collectors, local private collectors, and I think they have like a few hundreds of objects in the exhibition, which you could see the scale was huge, and just imagining the organization of getting, you know, all these private collectors to persuade them to give those antiquities to raise funds for the war effort. So, and also at the end of my talk, I did mention that there's an article in Launceston about a Chinese relief fund sales that's after the end of the war, 1946. So and this is yeah, rather common. And the Chinese Women Relief Fund was one of the many funds that across the world. So it's not just this only one. So there are a lot in Australia, and I also saw articles of the branches in like Philippines and what they have done, and also in Thailand as well. So they were all sort of this country also, you know, have really big Chinese diasporic community. So you can see it is an international network, and Australia is part of it. Yeah.
Somebody's asking if you've had an opportunity yet to share this research with Chinese communities in Sydney today.
No, I hope there is some Chinese community members today zooming in, which I don't know. I can't see who is here, but I'm hoping that with more sort of research, like maybe go to ABC archives to look at the radio, or maybe the National Sound Archive, which I know that Peter Hack, one of the researcher on this topic, that I'm showing some of the sound and film clip of the time and related to the Chinese Women's Relief Fund. So
well, we have reliable intelligence come through in the chat from a scholar of media studies who notes that the ABC Weekly and Wireless Weekly are now searchable in Trove. So we may be able to sort of at least pin down some of the dates when these women were promoting their efforts. And I'm going to try and squash in one more question. Somebody's asked a really interesting question about, you know, obviously the profile of these women was quite good at this time, although potentially strictly associated with their fundraising efforts. Do you have any evidence, have you come across anything yet that shows that Chinese women were able to have an identity, a public identity, in other ways disconnected from their fundraising? Were people starting to be interested in these women as people and not just as fundraisers?
Well, that's a really good question. And then I think this is like really beyond the scope of this research. We're seeing the other side of the reception of them. And I think that, you know, as we know that the archival materials on Chinese Australian history, particularly Chinese Australian women history, is so limited and scattered, and we could not even, you know, I mean, I'm talking about the groundbreaking work of the Locating Chinese Women, the edited volume, that they really had provided many stories through many researchers' years of effort to discover, to uncover that this archival material, and even this material that we need to build, and we need to get more. I mean, you know, we need to have more research fund to support researchers to go out to get this primary material about Chinese Australian women here. But then this is already difficult to go to the other side, the reception on how, you know, the reception of their work or their identity at that time. It is even more difficult than just finding, you know, what they have done at the time. So I think this is a really important work we need to be done when the materials have been gathered and the researchers have the funds and energy and means to research further. So my question is, I don't know, and I feel really inadequate even to look at the really limited history of the Chinese Australian women. So I think this is something that not now, I hope in the future, I'm sure that their reception at that time, we would you know, there will be more research come out to recognize that.
Well, I think you've done a great job today in just sparking our imagination of what might be possible. And they were surely such amazing women. I think we can just all go away from today and trust that people saw how amazing they were in their own time. So thank you for all of your work and drawing out those amazing stories from just tiny little threads that we have managed to keep of that particular history. For everybody here today, please don't forget to book a ticket for next time. In November, we'll have the last Scholar Talk for 2023, and we'll be looking at a very different group of migrant women. Alexandra Delios will be talking about Greek Australian women and the migrant welfare system, and how a group of quite entrepreneurial women and very determined ladies set up systems to help women, not necessarily back home in Greece, but right here in Australia, and those amazing networks. So that is Tuesday, the 7th of November at 11 a.m. But now please just thank Shuxia Chen for all of her work on this incredible, if very small, archive here at the State Library of New South Wales. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.